Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Trevor Phillips. I'm the chair of Index on Censorship, and this session is the first in a series of webinars and posts and events that we are holding in a series under the banner banned by Beijing. This session is called "Is China Censoring Europe?" And I'll come to that in a moment. Perhaps just to say a few words about Index itself. This year we are 50 years old. I haven't been chair all that time. In fact, I haven't been chair for more than about 10 minutes. But this is an organization with a very distinguished history, which was started by the poet Stephen Spender and others to highlight, illuminate, and publish banned works from behind what was then called the Iron Curtain, Solzhenitsyn, and so on. And they, of course, in many ways succeeded in their mission in bringing works, thoughts, elements of what was political and artistic culture that were being suppressed to the rest of the world. Now, today, many of these issues are, people would say, more complicated. At Index, we don't think that they're particularly that much more complicated. Whether you try to suppress people's thoughts and words and their artistic endeavors because of their geography or using technology, or indeed actually by different kinds of means, some of which we're seeing domestically, to get people to self-censor. Index's role as a global freedom of expression organization is to try to combat that, because in the end, it is the last freedom that human beings have, the ability to think and express their thoughts freely. And it's the one that we think fundamentally, most of all, needs to be protected. As I said, this is the kickoff for a whole series of events. Internationally, though we're based in London, we cover, as it were, the whole world. In September, we will be having our awards where we bring nominees who have distinguished themselves by their dedication and their effectiveness in preserving freedom of expression from all over the world. And it's one of the reasons that when I was asked to join the board, I joined, because it's humbling as a journalist, which is my profession, to see people, we complain in the West about people not talking to us and so on. Meeting somebody who takes on the role as a reporter in a local newspaper when they know that their predecessor has ended up dead in a gutter, and they take on the role, they come to London to get their prize, and then they go back home and carry on doing that job. It is incredibly humbling, but everything that we can do, wherever it is, we try to support. This year, we chose particularly two areas of concern. Our chief executive, Ruth Smith, was responsible for making what I think, to be honest, were two on-the-money choices. One is Belarus, where we all know what's been going on there under Mr. Lukashenko, including the recent imprisonment of someone who used to write for Index itself, and who we've learned in the last few days is being charged with some extraordinary myriad offenses. And of course, the topic of today's conversation, China. Last week, we saw the 100th anniversary of the CCP, and we have been seeing some of the ways in which the Chinese authorities have increasingly borne down on freedom of expression. Of course, some of that, the worst, the people who most see that are in China themselves. And before we came on, I was just speaking to colleagues who are in the panelists. I had occasion today, entirely by accident, to read an article which is about the lying flat movement, which is a sort of youth movement against the rat race in China. which is disapproved of by the authorities. And I'll just read you very quickly a piece of the article, a few sentences from the article I read to tell you where I think we've got to here. This article, which is by a scholar based in America, says, as state media made their position clear, the original post on lying flat suddenly disappeared. The search function for, quote, lying flat on WeChat, where the word had still been trending, was disabled. On the Douban social networking service, a lying flat discussion group was also shut down. And on Taobao, the popular online shopping platform run by tech giant Alibaba, T-shirts relating to, quote, lying down were pulled from online stores. I think that tells us something about the extent of what you might call state paranoia. The question we want to talk about today is to what extent that state paranoia reaches internationally, how we should understand what is going on, and if anything, what we should do about it. We're interested in at Index not just in censorship, but self-censorship. Way back in 2002, New York Review of Books gave an example of a US scholar, Caucasian American, who declined an invitation to speak to a major US news organization for fear that he might be denied a Chinese visa, lose access to his field work for speaking about an issue that the Chinese government would have deemed politically sensitive. We imagine there's much more of that now, but what we're also seeing is that Beijing is now actively trying to censor and discredit people who criticize the CCP and its policies, or who speak out on so-called sensitive issues. So what does this mean? How do we understand it in terms of freedom of expression in Europe and the West? And are there other things we should be looking out for? So to discuss it with us today are three people who I have to say, I mean, the word experts doesn't really quite do it. People who really are authorities in this area, studied it, and indeed, actually, a couple of them have effectively themselves been banned, but they will tell you about that, I think. Mareike Ohlberg, who is a China analyst and co-author of Hidden Hand, How the Chinese Communist Party is Reshaping the World. Tom Tugendhat, a British Member of Parliament. He's chairman of the UK's Foreign Affairs Select Committee and head of the China Research Group of MPs. And Edward Lucas, a journalist who, by the way, alternates with me as a Times columnist and is formerly a senior editor at The Economist and is currently the editor of the China Influence Monitor. So, Mareike, if I can start with you. Are we right to be worried, or are we all just getting overexcited?
I think I wouldn't be on this panel if my conviction was that this is all much ado about nothing. I think we have already seen a lot more aggressive posturing from the Communist Party of China, and we're going to see quite a bit more of that. And to briefly explain why that is, we can go back to something you mentioned in the introduction, and that is the Chinese Communist Party just turned 100, or actually it's turning 100 on the 23rd, but they celebrated early on July the 1st because that sounds nicer. And part of what this entails is the first centenary goal, where the CCP has made certain promises to the Chinese people. And one of the slogans that you will hear repeated over and over again is, first we stood up, then we got rich, and now we got strong. And now we got strong, that last part under Xi Jinping is the one that actually matters here, because part of being a strong country means being able to influence or determine what people talk about, not just in China, but globally, and how they talk about this. This is an essential part of being a strong country, which China now officially is under this first goal. A large part of this is positive agenda setting, at least in theory, bringing in your own theories, your own ideas, your own concepts, and getting people to repeat them. But there's also a negative agenda, a negative list, how to avoid anything that could be seen as criticism of the party or of China, defining what can and cannot be said, topics which the CCP must tightly control whether they're mentioned or how they're talked about. So the idea is, we've overcome war, we've overcome hunger, and now we're going to overcome the situation where foreigners can just run around and say anything about China that they want. And this kind of pressure shows it comes in all shapes and forms, and really is beginning to affect all areas. Sometimes it's very subtle, sometimes, as with the recent sanctions on a number of academic colleagues and my former employer, Mareike, it's not so subtle. But we see it in the cultural sphere. A lot of people have talked about the impact China has on Hollywood, but it's not limited to the United States. We also see this in Europe. In 2019, the Berlin International Film Festival had 2 Chinese films pulled, one dealing with the Cultural Revolution. And they basically played along. It probably just got blocked. It didn't get an export license, but the film festival played along and said, oh, it can't be played because of technical reasons. Basically repeating the excuse given by the Chinese censors for how it could not be played in order, presumably not to offend the Chinese government in the future. We've had films edited over here as well. There was this more or less famous incident where an Ai Weiwei segment was removed from a film called Berlin, I Love You. The filmmakers claimed it was for artistic reasons, but a number of people, including I himself, did not buy that and said, no, look, there were political considerations here. So what we've seen in Hollywood, we also see over here in Europe. I have a ton of personal examples of attempts to disinvite speakers at panels, conferences, whether that is at the university level, at the think tank level, at the NGO level, at the business council levels, where basically conference organizers or panel organizers will be approached saying, if person X speaks, wouldn't that be bad for our great relations with China? Or somebody approaching the conference organizers saying, look, if person X speaks on that panel, we won't join. In some cases, this is directly from the Chinese embassies in certain countries. Often it's via intermediaries, Chinese partners, or even local partners on the ground. There are a lot of examples. By and large, every other person I speak to has an example like that. I usually ask people. Most of them do not become public. And we therefore don't know the complete extent, but it is quite massive. It affects book publishing. In one case here in Germany, where I'm based, the Chinese rights holders for a book that had already been translated into German suddenly demanded changes be made. Basically, they didn't want to, it was the book that played in the Cultural Revolution, and they didn't want it to say, they wanted to portray the Cultural Revolution in a better light and said, if you don't make those changes, it can't be published. In a more extreme case, a children's book that mentioned that the coronavirus came from China came under attack. The publishing house was threatened by the Chinese consulate with a lawsuit. Simultaneously, you had a coordinated campaign of reviews that basically all stated, but the WHO has said the virus didn't originate in China. So they all said the same thing. It looked very coordinated. And in the end, the publisher pulled back and apologized. And there may be good reasons why you don't need to have the sentence in a children's book that it came from China, but they basically caved to the demands from the Chinese consulate and were scared that they might get sued afterwards or get arrested. And lest anybody think this only happens to, publishing houses or small actors that are insignificant, the same thing happened to the group of European Union ambassadors in China that wanted to publish a letter in the China Daily for the 45th anniversary of establishment of relationships. They also got it censored by Chinese authorities and had to take out a reference that the virus started in China and spread from there in order to get their letter published. And very regrettably, they went along with this. There are many, many more examples. I don't want to go over time too much, so I will stop here, but there are plenty more. Oftentimes, the boundaries between censorship and self-censorship get blurred, just like is often the case in the Chinese-speaking world as well. There is, and I haven't even gone into that, the indirect pressure through visa access, visa blacklists, etc. That's kind of a topic in its own right. Usually these incidents are small enough that on their own, they're not huge scandals, with some exceptions. I think some of them made quite big waves, but usually it's under a certain threshold where you can say, no, it's just one thing. What are you so upset about? I do think it's something to be upset about, but what's more important is there's a cumulative effect, that there are all over the place, rather small incidents that by and large change how China is talked about and how China is perceived. There is a cumulative effect and a pattern. Now, just to close off before before I hand over back to you, there's an argument, this isn't going to affect me because I don't work on sensitive topics that China might care about. This only affects other people working in these areas. This is problematic for certain reasons. One is the lack of care about censorship, but the other is it's also plain wrong, because the number of topics that are affected has been expanding. You could say maybe 20 years, you could say, okay, it's kind of concentrated on the areas, Tibet, Taiwan, Tiananmen, Falun Gong, Xinjiang, and small number of other topics. Right now, it's already expanded to include, the lives of the top leadership, the origins of the COVID pandemic, the economic situation of China, China's history, and a number of other topics that have popped up. And this number of topics, because it's part of how the CCP defines a strong China, is going to continue to grow. So if anything, we're going to see a lot more of this, and a lot more of this on a larger number of topics. So really just ducking and covering and saying, well, we won't just say anything that might offend the Chinese government. That's not gonna cut it. So we really need to work on an active strategy on how to counter this. And I'd be happy to discuss with everybody later what such a strategy would look like. For now, thanks so much for having me, and back to you, Trevor.
You're on mute, Trevor.
Beg your pardon. I beg your pardon, yes. Thank you, Mareike, very much for that. And I think you end up there with a proper challenge, actually, for the rest of us about what we do, but we'll return to that a little later. I've already failed in my first duty, which is to say to everybody who's attending, please do, if you've got questions, put them into the chat. You'll see the chat function. You can go into the menu top right-hand corner in Zoom, if you're not familiar with it, and you'll see the opportunity to put a comment in the chat, and we'll try and keep abreast of what questions people are raising. We'll see if we can group them into themes when we come to Q&A. Okay, our next speaker, it's, one in these circumstances, one always says needs no introductions, probably almost certainly true in his case here. Tom Tugendhat, MP.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to be brief because I'm rather more interested in the questions than in my words. 2 points, though, that I think are important. One is to support democracy, you need a free press. There is simply no alternative to it. And I tell billionaire friends, of which I have one or two, that if they actually want to support democracy, the first thing to do is to make sure that you support local media. The second thing to say is that censorship, and Mareike has just covered so much the China element that I'm not going to go over it, is also self-censorship. The amount of conversations I've had with academics, with writers, who have chosen not to write things because of the implications, the likely implications on them. And I don't mean legal action for libel, I mean the choice not to be criticized, the choice to maintain a visa, the choice to maintain connections, is increasingly pernicious. It is, of course, true that what we're seeing at home is not just the direct impact of hostile states, but the indirect impact of concern. And so for those of us who were sanctioned, as I was, it's worth remembering why we were sanctioned. It wasn't really to shut me up. It's actually nothing to do with me. I wish it were personal, but it's not. The Chinese state doesn't care about me any more than it cares about anybody else. It was intended to silence academics and business people and those who might otherwise have spoken out inside China, those who might otherwise have had stronger connections within China. So I'm going to leave it there because I think there's so much that we need to discuss, and I'm very keen to hear from others. Trevor, we can't hear you.
I beg your pardon. I thought I'd got used to this discipline by now, but anyway, I haven't. It's probably because I've been out of my house for the first time in 15 months in the last week or so. So I'm getting a bit giddy. I think it's very important, Tom. I think I would like to return to this question of the impact of what happens outside China on what takes place inside China, which I think is very, very important and not as a question not as widely discussed as it might be. but let's come back to that. Ed Lucas.
Thanks so much for having me. And it's a real honor to be on a panel with Mareike, who is far too modest to say that she's written a very good book, which you should all buy, together with Clive Hamilton, who's written 2 very good books, which you should buy. If you haven't read Silent Invasion about what's going on in Australia, read it. If you haven't read Cause of the Panda about what's going on in Canada, read it. And read Hidden Hand, which is about the party state's influence in Europe. And if I can also just humbly plug my own weekly China Influence Monitor, I've just put a link to that in the chat. You just Google China Influence Monitor and you can sign up for it on the Coda Story website or on the SEPA website, and that's a sort of weekly, slight, I wouldn't say light-hearted, but sardonic, and rather, and we try to be quite rude about the party state's westward footprint. I don't want to take up very much time because I see there's a vast amount of expertise in the audience. I'd much rather have their questions. I just want to give you 2 tiny case studies of stuff that happens, and both of which exemplify, I think, the real point, which is this isn't happening because we're weak. It's happening because we're weak-willed. One of them is Norway. If you're a Taiwanese student in Norway, you might think when you go to the Norwegian government website that you can sign up as a Taiwanese for your residence permit or health service or something. But as part of Norway's kowtow to China, you're not allowed to do that. You have to put yourself down as a Chinese Taipei student or some other approved formulation. And they're taking Norway to the European Court of Human Rights over this. And it's extraordinary to me. This doesn't make any real difference to Norwegians. It's just a meaningless bit of obeisance to the party state, which has this neurotic attitude that Taiwan must never be treated as a country. Another one, again, tiny in its actual importance, but symbolically very important. The Corporation of London runs something called the Lord Mayor's Show, which in the pre-COVID era was the main street party for the City of London, the financial district. And it's a very jolly occasion. They always say it's an apolitical day out for all the family. And for years, Taiwan, as a country that does a lot of business in the city, was able to participate in this with a float, basically a flat bed truck with sort of people in costumes on the back and handing out their, to me, rather revolting bubble tea. But anyway, that's their national drink and they should be allowed to promote it if they want. And because the City of London is trying to kowtow to the party state, they banned Taiwan. And for 4 years now, I've been trying to get an explanation from them about why they do this. And they will never answer. They only say the Lord Mayor's Show is a apolitical fun day out for all the family, and we're not going to comment further. And this is so annoying. It's not as if you had Chinese warships sailing up the Thames or Chinese tanks crunching down the streets of the City of London making us do this. We do this because we are greedy and because we're scared. And we are afraid of just the tiniest bit of displeasure from Beijing that some Chinese company might not list its bond or list its share in the City of London, and we might, some pinstripe somewhere might lose a little tiny bit of money. And so to do that, we just gratuitously join in the marginalization of Taiwan. And these examples may sound trivial, but actually what they represent is this weak-willedness, the way in which we again and again we're a pushover. We take the short-term financial or prestige advantage and sacrifice important points of principle. And you do that enough and you build up a kind of coral reef of small Chinese victories, whether that's in the media or in universities, on public events, or in any other part of life. What you put on your website as a private corporation or anything else, it's a little victory for Beijing. And it's really annoying. The good thing about this is it's absolutely in our hands to push back at this. If we wanted to, we can do what the Czechs did, send a delegation to Taiwan. And the Chinese huffed and puffed and said, we're going to blow your house down and there are going to be terrible sanctions and you'll regret the moment you did this. 90 Czech politicians and public figures, mayors and other people went to Taiwan this time a year ago, and basically nothing happened. There was one contract for pianos was cancelled, and in fact, a Taiwanese entrepreneur bought all the pianos. So basically, there was no substantial thing. Lithuania's also shown what it can do. If you get a vaccine in Taiwan, and remember that Taiwan is under vaccine blockade from the party state. They've bullied the German providers of the BioNTech vaccine not to supply any vaccines to Taiwan. 3 countries supplying Taiwan: Japan, the United States, and Lithuania, a country of 3 million people. And where's Britain in this? I find it absolutely astonishing that Lithuania is doing more on Hong Kong. They're offering humanitarian visas to every Hong Kong person anywhere in the world, regardless of whether they've got the right papers or not. They're doing that. We're not. They're doing stuff on vaccines. They're opening an office in Taiwan. If Lithuania, with a country of 3 million people and half our living standard, can do it, why can't Britain? The answer to this is in our own hands. We need gumption. And I'm very glad that Tom Tugendhat has gumption. And I just wish that other members of the ruling party in Britain and of the House of Commons and other decision makers would adopt a little bit of the spirit that Lithuania has shown in how to stand up to all this.
Ed, thank you very much. Characteristically robust there. We've got some questions, but I'd just like to kick off discussion with a couple of my own. You've all talked about the various ways in which the Chinese state is reaching out into Western European and British democracies. But what is the sector that most worries them, do you think? Is it journalism? Is it creative work? Is it what goes on in universities? What is the place that they would really most want to make sure that nothing that they disapprove of takes place? Mareike, where would you look?
Honestly, I think the one thing that they are most concerned about right now in the Chinese government is actual action forming on issues such as what is happening in Xinjiang. You've had a number of parliaments, including in the UK, come out and basically declare what's happening there is a genocide. But even if you don't want to call it a genocide, if you prefer to talk about crimes against humanity, if you're willing to actually make a determination, and if you're willing to actually act on that determination, that is something that can have an actual effect. I mean, part of this is symbolical statements, but in some cases, there's actual actions tied to that in terms of export controls, in terms of supply chains, in terms of the news of what is happening in Xinjiang right now actually spreading to more countries in the world and prompting more of a pushback from a number of countries in, say, the Muslim world. Like in Muslim majority countries, their politicians, maybe like in Pakistan, be absolutely craven about it, but there are people who do care about their fellow Muslims in China. So I think that is one of the things that currently the CCP and the Chinese government are most worried about, which is also why you've seen such strong reactions to basically anything happening in this field. With the sanctions, they were tied to Xinjiang, and the Chinese government basically decided we're going to hit back twice and threefold, and we're going to, make sure that such things never happen again, which is probably not going to be the case. I don't think nothing's going to happen, but if I had to pinpoint one thing, I think this is where the CCP is currently most concerned about.
Tom, I know that this is something that you raised. Would you agree that Xinjiang, the Uyghurs, I think, is probably what we would think about here? That would be the top contentious issue.
Well, I think that anything that affects internal stability is what China is concerned about fundamentally. It's the leadership are terrified of their own people, and I don't mean in the way that a democracy should be worried about its, the government in a democracy is concerned about maintaining the goodwill of its people. I mean, they're absolutely terrified of chaos, revolution, all the things that we've seen happening in Chinese history in the last century, right? And they're absolutely terrified that this could emerge from the West or the South or whatever. And so anything that feeds into that is something that is slapped down incredibly hard, which is why, yes, you're right. I mean, Xinjiang and the Muslim atrocities, the atrocities towards the Muslim community is part of it. But also you'll notice anything to do with corruption. The Xi regime is hugely corrupt. A lot of the family is extremely rich. I mean, quite extraordinarily wealthy. But any comments of that nature are very, very closely silenced. And like many corrupt dictatorships, what they're terrified of is people finding the truth. You'll know that actually many people in China are increasingly learning the truth, and you get various different memes that sort of express a truth in different ways. You know, the Winnie the Pooh, the sort of fatty bear, was one, and there have been many others. So I think that the greatest concern for the Chinese state is to do with the exposure of its ruling elite for exactly who they are.
Edward, there's someone's raised a question about universities, and probably there's two things to ask, and maybe Tom, you might want to respond to this as well. What is should we be worried about what's going on in universities? We read stories about students spying on each other and so on and so forth. And secondly, would the government's proposal for an academic freedom law in relation to higher education make any difference here? Edward.
We should be worried about what happens in universities. I've been recently involved in trying to get Anne-Marie Brady back on Twitter after coordinated troll and bot campaign by the party state had her kicked off for a bit. She's a leading critic of the Chinese Communist Party at the University of Canterbury. They've also tried to have her disciplined at the University of Canterbury for raising concerns about Chinese influence on universities. The position in Britain is not as bad as in some other places, but we've seen, for example, universities in Canada where they've come under pressure because they tried to have a Taiwan week or Tibet week. We've seen a student at the University of Queensland, Drew Pavlou, getting into trouble for, again, raising academic freedom concerns. So wherever they can, they advance. And we do see it a bit in this country as well. I've been contacted by someone at the University of Cambridge who's been told to stop, to change the content of his lectures because it will upset the, it's controversial, and I can't give too many details because if you instantly identify him, but it would be bad for his college's fundraising if he continued to teach this particular rather contentious point about China. And there's a very good piece in The Spectator this week about Cambridge University highlighting some of the things that have been going on there. I think one thing that's really important is to teach hard subjects like proper Chinese history, teach about Taiwan, teach about Hong Kong, teach about Tibet, and the real diversity of what happens inside China from an ethnic and linguistic point of view. Teach Cantonese, for example, because these are all things that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't like. And it's a little bit like Saudi Arabia, which put the squeeze on Islamic studies departments a few decades ago, really. It started trying to stop them looking at contentious things like the origins of the Quran and concentrate on nice, safe things like Islamic calligraphy and architecture and so on. So we need to push back against the weight of Chinese money, ensure free speech, ensure the protection of Chinese students on campus, because they're scared. They're scared that they can't speak. I know in an East European country, which I can't name, so again, it will be identified, where the students from the mainland China want to go to seminars but won't go because they're afraid that other students will report them for going to study dangerous things like human rights. And we really need to think about this. How do you do marking in a situation where the Chinese Communist Party agents may hack into the system and find out what people are writing in their essays? So we need to harden our system in terms of its cybersecurity, in terms of its human security, in terms of soft target protection, because it is a target for the Chinese, and we see what they're doing in other countries, and we don't want them to do it here.
Okay, Tom, I know you can't speak for the government, but Colin Hayhurst has asked the question about the both. Actually, he's asking about the online harms bill, I think, but essentially there's a question really about whether legislation can make an impact here, whether it's the higher education bill or whether the online harms bill, which gives some leeway to tech companies, not just American but Chinese companies, to decide, what should be on platforms or not. Do you think that we might be going down? We might be getting ourselves in a bit of a muddle here. Do you think?
Well, I don't think either of those two bills are particularly relevant to the bit that we're talking about now. I mean, both of them are to do. I want the first one's to do with cancel culture and the right to speak. And what we're here talking about really is the right not to be afraid, which I appreciate they're connected, but they're not quite the same thing. The reason people aren't speaking about human rights in Xinjiang is because they are concerned they won't get the visa, they won't get the funding or whatever it is, or the reason that the students aren't attending whichever course that Ed was just talking about is because they're concerned that there'll be repercussions on their family in the mainland, or perhaps on them. So it's a slightly different emphasis, whereas the cancel culture is really to do with the right of an individual to speak. But look, I do think there's a real challenge in our universities, and it's one that we've been aware of for a number of years. There's some very, very courageous individuals speaking out, like Steve Tsang, and there are many others who are doing their best, but it's very difficult. And I do think one of the essential things that we've got to do is we've got to help universities find a role through this and support them when they struggle, and yes, support them when they fail. But this is absolutely essential. I think people underestimate the importance of these courses and their abilities. Now, I have to say I was interested to hear Ed talking about other cultures doing that, and Saudi did it a bit, in fact quite a lot, certainly on Islamic studies. When I studied Islamics under Professor Patricia Kroner, who those of you who studied Islamic studies will know very well as the author of Hagerism and the Origins of Islam. She was, to say that she was cancelled by the various Islamic states was a somewhat understatement. I think she would have been more than cancelled had she fallen into the wrong hands. And there are very real threats here in how we maintain open dialogue and open communication. And I think this is actually one of the most important things that the government can do. So I look forward to seeing, I hope, the government assisting universities calling out those who operate covertly from the embassies in order to silence debate in our campuses.
Mareike, sticking with this universities question, do you think the government can do anything about it? And actually, all three of you might want to say something about this. Edward referred to the, I think it's New Statesman or Spectator, can't remember which one, talked about, has got a big cover piece about this. The big issue is the money. Big issue is the money. What can you do? I mean, you're a college or a university and somebody comes along and says, here's 5 million and we want you to do this, this and this. And do you just say no? I mean, how should one approach this? Mareike?
I think there's two sides here. One, I do think university systems work quite fundamentally differently in every country. So it depends a lot, in the UK, this could be handled quite differently than, say, in the United States or in Germany or in France. So they function differently. So it'll need to depend on the country. But I do think that it's two things. One, yes, governments should consult more with the universities. And I know that'll actually cause a lot of shrieking at universities in terms of interference, but especially I think where especially a lot of corporations and STEM fields where you can also cause more harm through dual use stuff or domestic surveillance in China. If you contribute to that, there's a role for government to step in. So yes, to alert people more, to alert universities more. But yeah, absolutely. Also in terms of not just saying you can't take money from China on this and this and that, but then also providing some alternative funds. I mean, there is, as much as I dislike Confucius Institutes, there are reasons why people establish them, because they could get money that had just been cut from them, at least in the German case, through mergers and through cut budgets of the universities over here. So yeah, you need to provide some money, and you need to provide a guiding role and give some guidance overall for how universities can handle this. But I do think a substantial part of this is going to have to be with universities themselves, and with universities and different fields or even across fields organizing better to push back against this more systematically. And that's, governments could try. I don't think this is something where government should get involved. This needs to be a different, for instance, in the area studies field, in Chinese area studies or anything. related to China, where you have studies associations. You could have a mechanism such as, I think the Middle Eastern Studies Association of North America has something where basically every time a country tries to interfere in academic freedom, they launch a complaint to the embassy and they make it very, very public, and they complain about it very, very publicly. And this is something that the China field needs as well, whether that is on a national level with national studies associations or in transnational studies associations, doesn't really matter. That needs to be, every time this happens, you need to raise the cost and you need to make it very public and you need to lodge a complaint. And once you do that, I could bet that the number of cases are going to go down, because the one thing that usually the person trying to complain or trying to restrict someone doesn't want to have is a huge public scandal. They count on the fact that people are going to keep quiet. So that to me is really key in how this can be solved.
Either of you got anything that you'd like to add on the university question, Edward or Tom? No, I want to move on to something different.
Move on.
Okay, fine. Mareike mentioned the Confucius Institute. I personally don't know anything at all about the Confucius Institute, but what someone has asked, essentially, Trojan horse or not, what should we think about them?
Well, I think it's a good thing to teach Chinese, and I'm learning it at the moment. It's jolly difficult. I'm in awe of people like Mareike who speak it. But would we allow the Russian government or the Soviet authorities during the Cold War to take over our teaching of Russian? No, we wouldn't. And this is it's a strategic weakness for us. We don't have enough people who know Chinese, but it shouldn't be dictated and shaped by a country that's basically makes it very clear it's an adversary. And I also object very much to the way Confucius Institutes can often operate in secret. They have hiring and firing arrangements which are not under the control of the university concerns. They operate as a kind of bubble of Chinese influence inside a university. They create financial dependencies and they displace other sort of teachings. So I think that we should be these are not huge amounts of money. I mean, compared to what you spend on something like an aircraft carrier, you could teach thousands and thousands of people in Britain Chinese for far less than that. And I know Tom's got a very soft spot for aircraft carriers, so I should try and find another example. But compared to what we're going to spend on a royal yacht, it would be cheaper to teach everyone Chinese. But it's a question of being masters in our own house. And this is it's very clearly, it's part of the party state's influence operations in the heart of, and shaping a whole generation of new China watchers. Leaving aside the question, it also teaches the mainland Chinese version of Chinese, which is not quite the same as the version of Chinese spoken in characters used in Hong Kong and Taiwan and in classical Chinese literature, which also gives a sort of extra edge to this sort of cultural hegemony that the party state's trying to push.
Tom, Philip Mead's asking a question in which he essentially says the government is sending mixed signals. On the one hand, taking a tough stance by cancelling G5 and criticising China over the Uyghurs, but then Rishi Sunak implying that we need to continue to do business with the CCP. I mean, it still comes back down to the heart question here, isn't there? Is there a danger, and I guess I could put this to all three of you, that Western governments are still slightly averting their gaze because of the economic relationship with China?
Look, I think that's. I think that's right, and I have to say, I think there is a challenge that the government doesn't have a coherent China strategy. It has several different policies, some of which overlap and some of which don't. And this is difficult because many different departments, or rather the various different departments, have different interests and different perspectives. The Treasury and the Department for Trade are naturally interested in one aspect. Home Office and Department for Education are interested in different aspects, and so on. So there is a challenge here as to how this coherence is brought together. It should be done in the Foreign Office. It's not really being done in the Foreign Office, but that's what the Foreign Office should be doing. The challenge that I think we've got is the point that Ed was making as well, which is you live with the consequences of these decisions, and you live with them because whatever you accept today has consequences tomorrow. So exactly as Ed was talking about the Confucius Institute, the reality is you're acquiring skills and talents that that may come with the price or with strings attached. And this is where actually I happen to agree with Ed on carriers. I was never a fan, but now we've got them. I'd much rather have hundreds of small ships than 2 big ones, but there you go. But the reality is that we do need to make decisions as to where we're going to invest. And we have far too few people who speak Chinese. We have far too few people, by the way, who also speak Arabic or Persian or many other languages. And I think emphasizing the fact that we need to internationalize our education is one aspect of improving our defensive posture.
Okay. There's a very interesting question, again, for somebody like me who doesn't know anything at all about it, but even I read about the Apple Daily closure. Mareike, how important is this, do you think? And the questioner has said, essentially, that there was a complete lack of outrage over this. Even the Guardian, I can't quite see the question, but I think the question says, even the Guardian simply lamented it as a dark moment, but that actually there was a sort of lack of weight given to this moment. Is that right? And should we have done more?
Yeah, I just got my, which is what I just grabbed. I just got my copy of the last ever edition of the Apple Daily last night, sent to me from Hong Kong. Took a while to get here, but I agree that by and large, and this probably goes for most of what's been happening in Hong Kong, the pushback has been too timid. I do think that the UK, compared to what a lot of other European countries, Lithuania excluded, have done, the UK has done better by and large, but still there hasn't been enough attention paid to it, and there hasn't been enough outrage about the fact that you're just going to terminate basically an international treaty over 20 years early. That's a pretty egregious thing to do. And we have seen all the consequences of just basically throwing one country, 2 systems out the window, way ahead of the actually agreed date to do that, which, you know, you can talk about whether that would have been problematic to have it suddenly terminated later as well, but that was a very open question. So by and large, the speed with which this has moved in Hong Kong, with the speed with which civil society, freedom of expression, the media have been completely shut down, is astonishing. And it really, what it does show you is how the CCP acts when it has the full freedom to act how it wants. One, because it has control over the territory. Like, you know, it's not going to gain the same control it has over Hong Kong over, say, the UK. That's not possible. But you can basically see the CCP moving at speed because nobody has stopped it, and there has been very little pushback. There has been, you know, from business, the idea that, well, we may have to leave because the International Financial Center is sort of unraveling, but we want to delay it as much as possible so we can pull out slowly. And this has been a problem, that there hasn't been much pushback at all, much standing up for that at all. And again, I think there are exceptions, and I'm actually, I do think some of the things that the UK has done are good, but it's not been enough, and it hasn't shown a very strong signal to the Chinese government that you can't just terminate a treaty early and get away with it. I think the signal it has sent to the Chinese government is you can and you will get away with it. And that's going to be a problem going forward for basically any other question that's going to come up.
Yeah, Edward and Tom, I find this, I've got to say, I find this quite, at one level, quite puzzling. And what Mareike just said makes a lot of sense, that actually every time China does something like this, it must feel emboldened because actually there appears to be no price to pay. And I'm thinking to myself, I came to some extent into public life and politics in a period when, you know, the great cause was apartheid in South Africa. And a lot of that, I mean, there were many things that went into the fall of destruction of apartheid, the apartheid regime, but at least part of it was the sense that that regime continuing to do what it did, and some of it was to do with what they did, not just in South Africa, but abroad, that they would pay a price with boycotts and all the rest of it. But looked at by the inexpert eye, it still feels really like the Chinese Communist Party can do what it's like, not just at home, but abroad with impunity. Is that too strong a statement, Edward?
It's a very good question. If you look at the Media Freedom Coalition, this is a group of, I think, 47 countries got together by Britain to stick up for the sort of ideas of media freedom, and it does include a few from outside Europe and North America and the sort of Five Eyes, there's sort of Botswana and a couple of other African countries and a couple of other Asian ones, and they've just issued a statement on the crackdown in Hong Kong, and several things strike me. One is it's highly concerned, which is obviously a bit less than gravely concerned, but not perhaps as much as desperately concerned. We're not exactly talking megaphone diplomacy here. And the other is that there's only 21 countries involved. Now, it's better than the last time they complained, which was over the Chinese party state's censorship of news about the Wuhan outbreak of the pandemic, and that time it was only 17 countries, and this time Italy's on board, so that brings all the G7 and Japan as well, so all the G7 are there. But still, there is not a single signatory from the continent of Africa. There's not a single signatory from Latin America. The only Asian country to sign up is Japan, and it really underlines if you look at this from Beijing, you think the West is seriously in decline, can't organize anything, is lost its credibility in both terms of how we run the financial system, in terms of geopolitics, failed wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. And they're just not that bothered by our criticism. It bounces off. And until we start doing stuff that really matters and really hurts, they will just think, well, that's just the losers are sort of spluttering on the sidelines, and we carry on munching away across the Eurasian continent with our very impressive push into Central Asia, where Wang Li, the Chinese foreign minister, is just rounding up all the Central Asian countries to say, right, what are we going to do about Afghanistan now? And where's the West? Nowhere. Ditto in Africa. Ditto in Latin America. So I think we've got to be pretty bleak and realistic and humble about this and say we're starting from the back foot.
Tom?
Yeah, look, I think I think Ed's right. I mean, the reality is, and I keep hearing this from various people, that we must engage with China because it's a massive economy and it's an important place. And I agree with that. It is a huge economy. But the reality is that China doesn't get to set the rules any more than the US does. China is about, well, depending on how you count, between 15 and 18% of the global economy. The United States is about 19, 20%. The rest of the free world, by the way, those countries that met at the G7 in Carbis Bay, make up 60, 70%. If we choose to act together, if we choose to actually stand up for these values, if we choose to leverage our partners and friends and actually invest in those relationships, then we shape the outcome. If we choose not to, if we choose to back away, if we choose to cut our support for others, if we choose not to engage in diplomacy or training teams or whatever it happens to be, guess what? Somebody else will. I mean, there's one very simple lesson from diplomacy, and I don't care whether you're the Italians at Versailles or indeed the well, I was going to say something else, but others are different.
Let's not go there.
If you walk away from the table, no matter how badly you think it was going while you were at the table, leave the table, and trust me, it'll go worse. It always does. And we have left the table in many parts of the world.
Having said, let's not go there, let me just read out a question from it's Geoffrey Harris. The European Parliament did give a strong signal on China over the CAI. The US and the EU are trying to develop a common approach. Where does, quote, global Britain fit in? Is not Britain rather vulnerable? What do you think, as somebody without a dog in this fight, Mareike?
Now I have to answer the global Britain question. That's not fair. I wanna give that one to the Brits on this call, which outnumber me 3-1. I mean, I don't know. I think I don't.
I guess a straight up question is: do we matter?
Yes, I do think that Britain has mattered in a lot of in a lot of these debates. It has played a role in plenty of them. It has been ahead of, I don't know, large parts of continental Europe in many of the questions that are at play. And I think Britain is just, another ally in a bigger alliance that could happen if, we get our act together, and Britain plays an important part there and has often actually been ahead of many of the other countries. So I really think it's more a question of abandoning this whole idea that now we are on our own, and now we need to really play good with China so that we don't don't have a problem. I think that whole trying to please all sides, wanting it both ways, that's something that I see with my own government as well. On the one hand, you want to be part of the alliance with the United States and other allies, but at the same time, you're trying to still be the one that can still do great business with China. I don't think that's going to work for very much longer. So I think Britain, like many, many other countries currently in this position, simply need to make not a complete choice. It doesn't have to be a complete either or, but need to send stronger signals. And I think in many ways that's actually already happened. So I'm actually more optimistic by and large about Britain than some other countries currently.
Okay, we're coming up to the end. I'm going to ask each of you just to say something to close, but in your closing, I wonder if you could offer us, and by us I mean Index on Censorship, some advice here. If you're a member of the board of Index, what is the kind of thing that we could do over the next year or a couple of years that you think could make a difference, given that we're a tiny organization, got no money, but we do have, if you like, a brand, and we have a magazine that goes widely, and we have, I think, recently acquired a stronger voice than we have had in past times. What's the kind of thing that we could do that could make a difference? Tom?
Well, look, I think the kind of thing we've got to do to make a difference is to coordinate. I mean, it's pretty simple. It's standing with countries like Australia. It's building alliances with countries maybe not quite on exactly the same path as we are at the moment in the European Union, helping allies and friends around the world, and making sure that those sort of competition states, if you like, those states that could be influenced by either side, get the support and investment they need to see that they have friends. And so I think that's my play. The only way we lose this fight is if we choose to compromise ourselves into obeisance.
Edward?
Yes, the West is still bigger and richer than China, and if you add in India and a few other countries, it's a lot bigger and richer, so we still have a chance to do it, but we need to think about the transatlantic and the trans-Pacific partnerships, which we let slip in the Obama years, and rebuild those. In terms of Index, I think it's quite simple. Find out whatever it is the Chinese Communist Party doesn't want you to do, and then do it. So have a conference on Taiwan, write about Tibet and East Turkestan and the Uyghurs and Inner Mongolia, and all these hot button issues, which the Chinese, these are exactly things the Chinese Communist Party doesn't want us to write about. And you can, you're in the business of busting taboos, so bust these ones.
Straight advice, thank you. And Mareike, what should we be thinking about doing, and any last words you have?
No, I think my advice to Index would be, you have the great advantage that you're sitting, what you have in terms of CCP interference and influence is great fragmentation. This is happening in different fields. Here's the journalists, here's the academics, here's the cultural sphere, here's the political sphere, et cetera, et cetera. And I think you're in a position, I mean, obviously, despite being a small organization, to say, we're going to look at this across different sectors, and we're going to discover patterns across different sectors, and we're going to give recommendations based on those patterns. And you can basically overcome some of that fragmentation that is frankly going to be needed if we're going to have a more coordinated, better pushback strategy. Now, different other things and different recommendations are still going to have to be implemented by the different fields, but you are in a position to bring a lot of these strands together and look at it from a more complete picture. And I think that's going to be very valuable.
Well, I'm really grateful to all of you for your advice, which I think is real and practical advice, and I will certainly take that away. As I said at the beginning of this conversation, this is the first amongst several events, and I hope those of you who've joined us this afternoon will join us again for the series of events. You'll be able to see them on our website, and actually as of next week, I think, early next week, you'll be able to see a YouTube recording of this conversation. We hope that you've enjoyed it, and I hope that you actually also do what you can to support Index. Join us, donate, read the magazine, and let people know that we're out there punching for freedom of expression. I know it's not an uncomplicated argument, but in the end, it does come down to a simple thing that provided you do no actual harm to others, then we ought to be able to hear each other, even if we don't like what the other person says. And obviously, in the issue we've been discussing today, that's a principle that's clearly not, if it was understood in Beijing, they've buried it somewhere. I want to thank our panel, it's been brilliant, Mareike, Tom, and Edward. And thank you all for joining us. Bye.